This is Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. Hey, my friends out there in the ether. This is Joel, and welcome to another episode of Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. Here I am in Dallas, and I am with the man, the myth, the legend, Trent Hunter. How are you doing, Trent, over in Denver?
Man, I appreciate that. You are not wrong. You are not wrong with that intro. I'm good, man. I'm enjoying. I'm looking out the window. It's a beautiful spring day here in Denver. We've had some nice spring weather, so I'm feeling pretty good. You know,
Yeah.
As optimistic, I guess, as you can be in this day and age. But
yeah. Turn off the TV, don't listen to any news, and optimism is possible.
I know, dude. I know. I would not describe myself as an optimist anyway. I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not one of those. I have a hard time relating with people who are like, "Oh yeah, I'm an optimist because you have to be." I'm like, "You do? A meteor's coming to crash into the earth, and you know you're going to die. You still an optimist? Why? I don't understand that part of it. But if I have reasons to be optimistic, I'll be optimistic. You know."
Sure. Yeah. Optimism as a coping mechanism goes by another name. It's called delusion.
Mm-hmm. True.
All right, friends. Yeah. We're going to dive into a topic that Trent and I have been discussing for a while. We dance around it in other podcasts, but it's the idea of pluralism. We'll get into that. But I am entitling this conversation, Worldviews Gone Wild. So, Trent, kick things off for us. What is the worst ideology that you have ever encountered?
I would have to say probably, totalitarianism seems pretty bad to me, totalitarianism in which there's just total control of the government infiltration and control of sort of every aspect of your life. I mean, North Korea would be sort of the example par excellence of this, where just everything is about Kim Jong-un and Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il, the holy trinity of the Kims there.
Sure.
But yeah, I think totalitarianism, it tends to sort of erase the capacity for critical thought. You're sort of slightly discouraged for thinking critically, I'd say. Mm-hmm. There's no political competition, which I think is quite healthy in a society. There should be competing ideas and parties, and that's all done away with. And so, I think a society that is totalitarian, and maybe it lasts for a while, but I think ultimately becomes hard to sustain. A society, how can you, in a globalized world, how can you compete ultimately unless you have a sponsor state, which like North Korea has to a somewhat of an extent? They have China sponsoring them.
Sure.
But how do you compete in a global environment when you're crushing so much of what makes a society really healthy and competitive, in my opinion? So how about you, Joel? What's your flavor of the day for ideology you can't stand?
Well, there's a lot out there, but I was Googling something and I ran across this interesting website. It seems like kind of like BuzzFeedy kind of website, but it's just called The Top Tens. I think it's like thetop10s.com. And there was one of the lists was around political ideologies, and they do sort of like crowdsourcing voting on what are the worst ideologies. And number one was National Socialism, which is tantamount to Nazism, kind of the par excellence example there. After that's fascism. And I think maybe both of those could fall under the umbrella of totalitarianism. There's a lot of overlap with the isms. And it's so strange. We're here talking about this, and it feels like there's a strange resurgence of these ideas that growing up in the 80s and 90s, I was under the false impression that we had kind of put all of that bullshit to bed, but somehow we are living through a very unwelcome resurgence of old,
Hmm.
terrible ideologies. But the one on that top 10 list that really grabbed my attention, I was just like, oh, I'm not sure I like that. I think I detest it. It was
Hmm.
number 5, and they called it anarcho primitivism. So anarcho, like anarchist, primitivism. And the idea is that let's remove modern civilization, like get rid of, deindustrialize things, the abolition of the division of labor, abandonment of large scale organizational technologies. Basically, let's go back to being primitives. Think the alpha males who all like have wet dreams about being in The Walking Dead. They all like, oh, I just want to have a gun and the reason to kill anything. So
Yeah.
Trent, can you imagine
Yeah.
if we all went back to a world without technology, medicine, and science? What would happen?
Well, Joel, I mean, here is where you're getting me, because you know how much I love to study anthropology. So there is that part, that wistful part of me that imagines sort of that Rousseauian Garden of Eden where everything was wonderful and innocent, and of course that is a myth. But I do think that no, we cannot. I agree with you in the sense that we cannot undo what we've done and go. We're not equipped to go back to live in a time and place where things are extremely rustic and there is very little in the way of sort of like cultural progress or uh, uh, artistic outputs and building projects, where you're just kind of living in huts by the river and hunting and living just hand to mouth.
Mm-hmm.
We can't go back there, but uh, so yeah, I don't deny the great things that civilization has given us. At the same time, I think that it is true that there are and have been groups of people around the world who have found a measure of happiness and contentment living in a very simple way. Now, they have very, very different problems than we have. If you break your leg, you might die. If you get a certain infection, you're dead. You might be more
Mm-hmm.
susceptible to dying from warfare, these kinds of things. So they definitely had different problems. But what I've read of different societies, think of the Yanomami people in South America, the Piraha, the Hadza in Tanzania. These are places where, even though they face great hardships, they have an experience of community and intimacy within that community that we just cannot. We've lost that. That's one of the main things I think we've lost, and we're struggling
Mm.
to find ways to approximate that in our civilized world.
Yeah. I love it. I love that. That I detest the idea, but you bring out some decent ideas. They're like, yeah, there is kind of this hedonistic, idealistic perspective of like, what if we could just remove all the ills and go back to living in loincloths, but also not have malaria. So that would
Yeah.
be great.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm okay. I'm okay with that. Great answer. Okay, so this is a podcast about the various worldviews that we encounter on a daily basis. Since the advent of the internet, the societies of the world connected in a way that has never been seen before. This is all in our lifetime, some very dramatic shifts, not just in our culture, but across the globe. We call it globalization. And almost overnight, we became intimately aware of what was happening all over the world. It changed the way we do politics, changed the way we do economics, policies, and international trading. And all the kind of the ways that we did things in the past became irrelevant almost immediately when we had this digital communication and the way that we can share things and the way news kind of happens. Don't even get me started on the 24-hour news cycle and social media. So you and I were born in the late 70s, but we now live in a completely different world. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I do agree. I mean, things have changed dramatically in the past past 10, 15 years, big time,
Yeah.
right? There's been a lot of changes in technology and changes in the way that we relate to each other and what we know about the world. I mean, I think maybe one salient point that I could make about it, Joel, is that there's so much more. We have so much more access to knowledge in so many domains. We have so much more access to knowledge about the world around us. And yet I think that what we've traded, what we have gained in quantity, we've sort of lost in quality. So the ability to sort of go really, really deep into subjects, I suspect that we've probably lost some of that. The ability to sustain concentration on one particular topic for a long, long time, when we are sort of, our thumbs are just used to just doing this, or doing, right to left, or down, down, down,
Yeah.
up, up, up. We can go from one soundbite, one 30-second video to the next. And so really diving in deep to important discussions, important topics, I wonder how much of that has been lost. And also, I've heard it said, Joel, once before, that Americans aren't really fond of history. We're not natural historians. We don't have 800-year-old culture in the United States. We're still, relatively speaking, a
Babies.
young
Yeah.
nation. And I think that sort of living in history, it doesn't make you less passionate about, let's say, things like current events. It doesn't make you less passionate, but it does give you the ability to sort of, I was talking with a friend of mine yesterday who's in his, I think, late 60s. And for example, he was telling me, he said, Trent, what's happening politically and socially right now in our culture is wild. He said, I don't remember anything this momentous happening since the 1960s. But he thinks maybe things will get even crazier than 60s, but in his mind still, given like civil rights and all the protests that were happening and the run up to the Vietnam War, the music scene, there was just so much upheaval and turmoil in the 60s. But being someone like myself who didn't grow up in the 60s, I don't have that sort of right in front of me. And because Americans
Sure.
are very forward thinking, we don't often carry history right next to us. So everything that's happening seems like it is the worst possible time, when in fact we've
Yeah.
had analogs to this. And
Yeah.
so I just think we're so inundated with so much information that sometimes it's harder to step back and see the whole forest instead of just the
Yeah.
individual trees. So what's your
Yeah.
take on it, Joel? What would you reflect on about the current moment compared to even 20 years ago?
Yeah, I think the big difference, Trent, because I do agree that there is a lot of overlaps from what I've read about and heard about of the '60s in terms of turmoil, just a lot of uncertainty and fear. Um, However, what's different today is we live in a much different world. Uh, in the '60s, it was still a lot of isolated communities. It was still not a lot of diversity. Like immigration in the United States back then was just white Western Europe. So we live in a world now that is diverse in so many different ways. It's not like, hey, are you Protestant or Christian? It's like, what one of these 50 things might you identify in? And you're still probably going to check the box none of the above, right? And so
Yeah.
we live in a very different society, and I think the connectivity with different cultures brings awareness to people, like what's happening in Rwanda or what's happening in Thailand. We have there's so many like documentaries and stories, and the information. I think I like what you said there. There's been an increase in quantity, but not necessarily quality of knowledge, and so it's creating a lot of things to be anxious about, and not a lot of incentive to sit and develop wisdom about any of these things. And so that is a powder keg of people who have stopped taking their Prozac, and we are in trouble of anxiety just taking over. And so I think about a book I read in seminary. It's called the Universe Next Door. It's been reprinted multiple times. It was is a Christian book, but it was talking about various worldviews that people have. Theism and atheism are the easy ones, but there's multiple other worldviews that we encounter that are actually our neighbors now. They're not, as a Christian, growing up as a Christian, I might hear about these ways of thinking from a missionary who came and spoke in my church. Nowadays, they are sitting in the cubicle next to me, and it's
Right.
a very different world in that way. And so, well, this book attempted to persuade others that the Christian worldview is the best one, and in my opinion, that book was not persuasive in saying that. It was basically just trying to use apologetics to back other people into a corner. But it was interesting when I read that book to see the various pluses and minuses of cultural perspectives. So, Trent, I say all that to say when it comes to ideologies and worldviews, the word that is often used is pluralism. So can you tell us all a little bit about that word and how it applies to our context?
Yeah. So pluralism is basically it's an appreciation of diversity. It's an appreciation of diversity and an attempt to learn and value the ability to live peacefully with people who do not come from the same background, the same race, creed, sexual orientation, family background. Just think about as many different factors as you can imagine. It is pluralism is sort of the belief that learning to get along with people who are very different than you is a positive thing, if not an easy thing, if not even necessarily a pleasant thing, but it's a thing that's worthwhile for us to do. And so because of the context that you've highlighted, you've drawn attention to the world that we live in that is so, I mean, compared to even like you said, the 1960s, we have a very diverse country. Let's just talk about the United States right now. We have a very, very diverse country. And so we can either break down into the smallest possible factions, even into like individual atomic families.
Yeah. Yep.
And say screw everybody else who's not like us. But the problem is, or maybe not a problem, but the opportunities, we are a highly integrated society, right? We are so highly interdependent upon one another. So the question becomes, if we think that is a good thing, or at the very least something we cannot get away from, pluralism is a way of thinking about how do we do this well? How do we live with each other well? A very basic example, Joel, is let's say you and I were going to go on a trip together, and we were shooting out ideas, and I said, I really want to go to the ocean, and you said, I really want to go to the mountains. Okay, so that problem right there is sort of a very basic introduction to a very, very small microcosm of pluralism, meaning we have different ideas, we have different things that we want to do. How do we negotiate that? Now, when you multiply that by many times over, and now you involve thousands upon thousands of people or millions of people who all have different wants and these kinds of things, how do we find ways to move forward with that? And pluralism faces that desire that we have, or I should say, it embraces the reality that all of us have a creed, all of us have sort of a basic worldview that we're passionate about, and we don't want to leave that behind. But we also know that there are people that we do business with, that we're friends with, that we see at the store, that we see at the bar, at the restaurant, that we visit with when we're visiting family and civic organizations and these kinds of things. We know there are people who have very, very different ideas than we do, and we want to find ways to promote our creed and yet also be accepting and maybe even open to what they have to talk about. So it's that rubbing up against each other with our different creeds, with our different dispositions and desire and ideas about what our country should be and how to negotiate that space. Uh, so it's not really an ethereal or highly abstract concept. It's basically like, how do we? If I could reduce it to layman's terms, I would simply say pluralism is about the question: how do we get along with each other in a world where we find that we've got a country full of people who are very, very different than each other? We can
Sure.
either splinter off into smaller groups, or we can talk about the practice of pluralism, what that encompasses, and what kind of people we have to be within that space.
Sure. It makes me think of the bumper sticker, the tolerance one that has all the different like symbols. What do
Yeah,
you think
yeah.
of that sticker?
On the one hand, I like it. I like the concept of tolerance. I think the
Mm.
tolerance is fantastic, but I think that I also want to introduce. Maybe I'm jumping ahead of things, but William Connolly in his book Pluralism, which had a big impact on me about 10 years ago, he talks about tolerance, but he also talks about the concept of like agonistic respect, which is tolerance. I feel like is somewhat what's a word for it, Joel? Tolerance is sort of like you need to celebrate these different groups,
Mm.
or you just need to tolerate them. Agonistic respect is I may not like another group's viewpoint, but I want to do
Mm-hmm.
business with them. I think that there's
Mm-hmm.
value in us getting to understand each other more. And at the end of this discussion, let's say I sit down with somebody who is a Catholic, and I didn't grow up in a Catholic background. But I sit down. I I don't necessarily need them to come away from that discussion agreeing with my atheism, let's say.
Sure.
And they may not expect that I come away that I've turned into a Catholic, but we believe within a pluralistic context that the interaction with each other could be valuable. We may leave disagreeing perhaps even more strongly, but we've had the chance to have the discussion and understand each other. So I like the bumper sticker. I definitely do. Um, but I think what pluralism isn't necessarily about me being comfortable with other people's ideas. It's that we agree to do business with each other, and we might still remain frustrated after having talk to each other. But we agree that we're going to keep the conversation going. We're going to sit with that discomfort and keep it going. What about you?
Mm.
How do you
I like
how
that.
do you respond to that bumper sticker?
I mean, I used to hate it
Yeah.
when I was back in my more evangelical perspectives. However, I see it as something that's quite important
Hmm.
as a virtue, as a practice to bring not only um, like functional interactions in society, but personal peace. If my way is the right way and everyone else is the wrong way, I'm living in a world of just battle. I'm battling everything and everyone around me, and that to me is just a terrible way to live. It's going to have a massively negative impact on my psychology. And I heard you mention William Connolly, and he has this concept that you introduced me to called contestability. And so the
Yeah.
idea is that there are many ideas, most of which are abstract in nature, ideas like art, ideas like religion, ideas like philosophy, and no one really can agree upon what those terms mean. They're kind of like up for grabs. There may be like a pool of meanings that you might call for art, philosophy, or religion. You know what people are talking about, but no one can really agree on one definition, and they are more about personal values than they are about verified facts. So therefore, these ideas and definitions get argued about, contestability. So Trent, tell us why Connolly's work has resonated with you.
Well, yeah, I'll stick with the idea right there of contestability. I mean, let me speak to sort of my evolution as a person, my changing worldview. You remember me, 20 years
Hmm.
ago when I was a fanatical Christian and Calvinist, and I believe so strongly in heaven and hell, and I really, I mean, there was a time even before that, at this point when I knew you, I had abandoned this particular notion, but there was a time when I thought really that the Assemblies of God was sort of on a higher plane of spirituality than other denominations.
Yep.
And then but what I began to realize is I had conversations with more and more people, particularly people who were good people, Christian and non-Christians of other stripes, but Christians and non-Christians. They were good people. They were intelligent people. And I began to see that as much as these ideas just made complete sense to me, they were unintelligible to other people. And I realized that I could stay within my small little bubble at church, and we could all agree with each other, and we could all recite the same creeds and sing the same songs and agree about our sort of, Baptist conservative theology.
Sure.
But the moment I went out into the so-called public square, this language, this grammar wasn't shared by other people. And if I wanted to have a life outside of the church in which I was engaging with other human beings in a way that was productive and pragmatic, I had to start making some changes. And I didn't think, and I don't think, and Connolly makes a good point about how he says something like, you cherish your beliefs, you cherish your doctrine, your core doctrines, you never leave it completely at home, but when you go into the public square, there's got to be the Heisman shove. It's got to be a little bit away from you. There's got to be a little bit of different distance, even though you don't leave it completely behind. To the extent that that all Americans are able to do that somewhat, we can have better discussions. And again, we're not to have a pluralistic environment. We're not asking people to abandon their core beliefs. One of the great contributions, I think, of Connolly's book Pluralism is he suggests that we, for ourselves and for other people of faith, monotheistic faith or Hinduistic or Buddhistic, people can consult their sacred texts, and within their sacred texts find resources for how
Sure.
to engage in public life. You and I both studied the scripture extensively, and I think we both attest that there's definitely resources in the Bible, both in the way that the
Absolutely.
Bible interacts with itself. It has a conversation with, like, intertextually, but even there are individual passages within books of the Bible where you see people, like in the book of Acts, where they're trying to have this ongoing negotiation and counsels about how are people who are not part of the Jewish tradition going to be integrated into the faith. These were real live problems that required people to meet face to face and to be open to the ideas of another person. And I think I'm kind of rambling here, but I think it's an exciting process, a process of growth and discovery. And God, I can learn something from you, and you're probably going to learn something from me. And there's going to be a little bit of shift in the way that we see the world, but we don't necessarily need to fear that. And so I think that's what's exciting. It's the process of coming together, not abandoning our core beliefs, seeing if there's ways that we can build bridges of understanding, to each other.
I love
What
that.
do you think about that? So,
I think you're onto something there. For me, coming from similar backgrounds to you, and for people who aren't aware, there are some strains of Christianity that have deep convictions around the term evangelism, and that's where you get the word evangelical. And baked into the faith is a very strong impetus to convert others. And
yes,
other religions have parts of this. Islam has parts of that. You don't see that as strong in Judaism and the Eastern kinds of beliefs, but you see that we're as strong in other kind of Christian adjacent movements like the Latter-day Saints and people, Jehovah's Witnesses and things like that. Very strong component of getting other people to join my ideology. And I remember when the first examples I had that was so uncomfortable for me, having grown up and believing all of those things, even though I was uncomfortable with it, I hated the idea of persuading others and like manipulating them through fear and persuasion to believe like me. I hated it, but I still did it because, like you, I was told that this is what it means to follow God and to be obedient.
Yeah.
And I was on a missions trip, and my first missions trip was to the Philippines. So I was like jumping in the deep end. I spent a month on the other side of the planet, and we did some service work over there, working with Habitat Humanity, building some buildings. But then we went down to Mindanao, which is the southernmost island of the Philippines. There's a very large Muslim population there, and we were at some sort of big festival of sorts. And I think this was one of our days off, and we were just kind of like enjoying ourselves, going to this festival, trying different foods. And there was this hut, and me and another person on a trip went in there. And there was this man who was clearly in the hut was a lot of paraphernalia around Islam, and he was a Muslim, a Filipino Muslim, and he was so kind. His smile, the way he interacted with us, he asked us what our faith was. We told him Christian, like ready to like defend ourselves, and he was just like, oh, and then he began to talk about Jesus the prophet, and at the time I didn't know a lot about Islam, so I was like, wait, what? And it really threw me for a loop. And that began the process of all of these stereotypes and all of these prejudices that I had been given, which weren't accurate, weren't true.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that helped me, fast forward many more years when I became a pastor. I had already let go of this stupid idea of witnessing to everybody, trying to persuade everybody. Now, listen, I'm an opinionated guy, right? If you're around me long, you're going to hear some Joel Triska opinions, right? That's I don't know. It's hard for me to turn off that tap. They just flow like water. But I also want to be in integrity with myself. I want to know that those are my thoughts, those are my opinions, those are my views. And while they may inspire others or challenge others, I have zero expectation that others conform to those. In fact, I'm always open to hearing new points of view that I haven't considered. And so when I became a pastor, we removed the word evangelism and we replaced it with the word compassion. And for us, compassion was the best way to evangelize. What's more attractive than someone acting empathetic and compassionate towards you? And so for me, that was very, very big shift away from my upbringing, and I was violating very strong teachings and altar calls that I experienced as a kid. And we both have backgrounds in biblical studies, so I'm wondering, for you, Trent, is there any biblical precedent for engaging a more pluralistic perspective?
Yes, there is. And this is where I think I might say a word about how, even though I'm an atheist, I'm still so passionate about like biblical study. The Bible's a mixed bag. There's good stuff and bad stuff, but it's great literature. It's the foundational book of Western civilization. Um, it's an enduring book, collection of books, really.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons it's exciting to me is because I've learned to read it from a humanistic standpoint. I don't carry with me the assumption that it was necessarily inspired by God. Men of God were carried along by the Spirit to write these things. I think it was written by human beings that we don't know much about, and they had their various motives. But if you can look at it from that standpoint, sort of from the ground up, things get really exciting.
Yeah.
So there's many examples, I think, in Scripture. Again, I'd mentioned a few minutes ago this intertextuality, meaning like you can sort of make books of the Bible or even sections within books converse with each other. That seems you're almost in some instances seem to be invited, like we've talked about the book of Job, how Job has different genres. It's almost like they're set in conversation with one another. But I want to make a specific reference to the book of Romans in the New Testament. Romans is seen as this great theological exposition of some of the core doctrines of Christianity. And yes, I
Mostly
think
by
it does.
Baptists.
By Baptists.
Yeah.
I mean, Baptists, I mean, you get to like sections on sort of like doctrine that would seem to speak to support the doctrine of election, and they just get hard-ons for that, man. I mean, they get excited.
Bro, you say justification, they start to get a little jittery, and then whew, they become Baptist-costals.
Man, they get excited. But I really don't think that it's primarily a theological book. This is me looking at it from a humanistic perspective. Here's what I see. It appears, just reading Romans, from what Paul says, that he wants to come to Rome. He seems to have this desire to sort of be helped by the church in Rome to sort of go onwards to Spain for missionary journeys. He wants them to partner with him in that. But he's really concerned that this burgeoning Jesus community, body of Christ, becomes integrated and unified. And he's concerned that Jews and what we call Gentiles, non-Jews, Jews and Gentiles are not able to come together because of cultural differences and because of theological differences and ancestry and all these kinds of different barriers. So he has to deploy a theological argument, and I'm not saying he doesn't believe in it, but he crafts this theological argument to show both Jews and Gentiles that they're both sort of equal before God, in the sense that they really bring nothing to the table. That yes, that the Jews were favored by God historically, that they were blessed by God, but that doesn't give them sort of any special privilege anymore. That, and this is the whole like Martin Luther insight that he had, was that it's really the name of the game in Christianity is that you are saved by faith, saved by grace through faith. And the power of that within this book is that it shows both Jews and Gentiles that Gentiles can come to God, like not through circumcision, but by believing in the good news of Jesus Christ and accepting that, embracing that, and calling him Lord and committing their lives to Jesus. Well, it's in some ways, even though I disagree with the theology and the claims, in some ways it is a beautiful thing, because he wants these people to be in agreement with each other. He wants them to overcome their unnecessary petty differences, and he deploys this great so-called theological treatise to do that. And I think it's just a creative moment where he has to, Paul the diplomat, he has to find ways to bring these communities together. And that's a great example for us in a sort of secular environment, the environment we're in today. It's a biblical example of how people went about doing that. How can we find common ground with each other? I mean, one simple way from that lesson is, hey, we're all basically idiots, and we all have our own struggles and our own shortcomings. We all sort of fall short, to use a biblical like phrase. And we all need forgiveness from one another. We all need grace. We all need understanding. And that's where we're all alike. We all basically do stupid shit and have our really weak moments. And that would be a biblical contribution to the current discussion about pluralism,
Yeah. And what's interesting, what you're kind of talking about there, is it took me a while to see this, but it's basically Paul who single-handedly moves this what was at the time just a sect of Judaism, these Jewish Christians, the followers of the way, right? These little Christs. he takes this movement and he pushes it forward to include the rest of the Roman Empire's population, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which he focused on Hellenized Jews, which were Jewish people with Greek culture that didn't live in Israel, but maybe had more of a culture of the Greco-Roman Empire. But then he moves in outside of the Hellenized Jews to these other cultures, and he did this. Jesus didn't do this. Jesus told his disciples to go into all the world, but other than the Samaritan woman and the Syrophoenician woman, we don't really see him encountering a lot of non-Jews. He talks with Pilate at the end before his
Right.
crucifixion.
Yeah.
This is Paul who does this.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
He uses his arguments, his persuasion to basically shift theology. Now, I was just thinking in my head, Paul's letters we know were likely written well before the Gospels came into full being. So
Yeah.
it's possible even that Paul's writings influenced some of the stories that the Gospel writers chose to highlight in the Gospels, especially the Gospel of Luke, where Luke was a Gentile influenced by this Jesus movement, and he is the one who emphasizes on the marginalized, the lepers, the women, the tax collectors, and the Gentiles. So I think that's so fascinating. You're right. There is a precedent for this in the Bible. Sadly, a lot of American Christians don't seem to have a fucking clue about what the Bible actually says.
Yeah. And just another brief story. Keep this brief, Joel. But years ago, when I was attending a church that was more in the Reformed tradition, they used the Westminster Confession of Faith as sort of their doctrinal bedrock, and so we were going through that. And in the process of learning about that statement, I read about the Westminster Assembly, which gathered together different church leaders to get together and craft that doctrinal statement. And you'd think that'd be pretty boring to read about, but it's actually really fascinating because you see that all these people got together in like a convention and they had to overcome their differences. There were certain people who had like these doctrinal pet projects and they wanted them to be sort of endorsed by everybody, and most people were like, no, we don't care about that, or we don't agree with that. And these people had to be like, well, I guess if we're going to craft this confession, I'll sort of forget about that, or I'll save it for another day. It's just like, and you end up with this doctrinal statement that basically what it does is it reflects a pluralist mentality that we all have to at some level get together and try to make this thing work. Because if all of us hold on to all of our pet projects and every jot and tittle of doctrine, we're never going to get anything done.
Yep.
And so it's a very human document, even as people see it as the spiritually important document. It's a reflection of what humans do, whether they're in the Islamic tradition or whether in the Hindu tradition. People have to deal with each other, and they have to find ways to get along within groups so the group can survive. So
yeah,
I just think that stuff's fascinating.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, you just remind me of a trip I took to Northern Europe with a bunch of young pastors, and we were studying churches in Western Europe, post-Christian cultures. Churches are dying, and we heard a couple denominational leaders speak, and basically these denominations were dying, and they all had their, like America, they all had their little distinctives and their organizations, but they were all shrinking. And basically, they all decided they needed to coalesce and come together. And the only way for them to do that was for them to take all their doctrines and put it on the table and say, like, let's decide on what matters. Right? Because if they didn't figure this shit out, they were all going to just disappear.
Right.
So sometimes it takes a crisis for people to take that step towards what actually has always made the most sense anyways. Trent, people can get a little bored with these abstract ideas that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Philosophical. Joe Blow from rural Indiana doesn't give a shit about pluralism and contestability. So help us make this practical? Why do these ideas matter? How can we move forward as individuals and a society?
Yeah, I would say, Joel, if I was to change the terminology so that it doesn't sound cerebral or academic, I just had a random audience of Americans taken at random. I wouldn't probably talk about contestability and pluralism stuff. I would simply say, hey, the reality is we live in an increasingly connected, interconnected world, in a world in which we're so interdependent for everything. If we value having that, let's say you mentioned Joe Blow from rural Indiana, right? He relies upon a whole host of technologies and infrastructure to get his crop harvested and get it to market. He needs the rail
Sure.
system to be working. So there needs to be people who are skilled in logistics. There need to be adequate roads. He needs to have sort of maybe access to the internet and cell phone service and all these kinds of things, and truck drivers, and then again logistic supply chains, and then grocery stores that are going to work, and you know fair prices, people who are involved in helping them get a fair price. All these sort of people that we need each other, and
Uh-huh.
so because we need each other so much, we just have to basically figure out how to get good at dealing with each other.
Yeah.
And that's simply what I would say to people: is forget about pluralism and contestability, and don't forget about it. But like, if we didn't talk about the stuff, I would just say we live in a world where, and don't you think, given this moment, it's become even increasingly clear, like people have so many different ideas of what they think that the United States should be.
Yeah.
If this union is sort of going to survive and persist, we have got to get better at civic discourse, talking to each other, and moving forward in a non punitive way
Mm-hmm.
towards each other. This whole political mafioso mentality of retribution and getting
Mm.
back, and we're in office now, and so we're going to do this, and fuck you. Like, that's not really sustainable, I don't think.
No.
Like, we have to come together in certain ways with certain given sets of core values where one of the things about pluralism, it seems to imply that we're going to treat each other with kindness. That is going to be sort of a bedrock value. And we can have very heated discussions and we can really disagree with each other, but we're going to retain kindness. We're going to not try to slaughter each other verbally. Some of these values are just going out the window. We would
Yeah.
rather just do. I think pluralism implies we would rather not fucking kill each other or destroy each other, or slander each other. We can disagree furiously, and keep going on. So, yeah.
You make me think of you've seen American History X?
Yes. Ooh, that's a
When
tough
Edward
watch,
Norton
man.
yeah, oh gosh, it is a tough watch. But when he goes to prison eventually, and
Yep.
he starts seeing the little like the gangs, and he's comes in at this this leader of the white supremacy ideology, and the white
Yeah.
supremacist group he's noticing is interacting with other ethnic groups, and he calls them out and says, you're not following your own, and he's the idealist, right? And he
Right.
gets lambasted, right? They figured out how to like work together for the sake of their own economy, their ecosystem. They're in prison, and he
Yeah.
comes
Yeah.
in trying to like throw shade on everyone, and gets a shit kicked out of him. And then the
Yeah.
person that
Yeah.
helps him is a black man, right?
Yeah.
Who helps him navigate that and becomes his like friend. And this
Yeah.
is where I think when we that's why I think you're right. It's not sustainable. When people act in that way, we are breaking down the connections between people that we need to keep the ecosystem going. Our economy it's right now, it's not doing great, but there's a lot of promises that it would be doing great. And if it does do great, I don't trust it to be real. I feel like it's just a veneer, because the best way to get economy going is when people depend on each other and the machine starts going and there's mutual like self-interest that's working together versus just
Yep.
like we're gonna crush you guys for the sake of making myself bigger. That's gonna bite you in the ass eventually. And
Yeah.
so it's super interesting to me when I look at when you use the word interconnectivity, like pluralism, that's what it's talking about. We need each other. And I'm curious, just kind of wrapping things up, how might you describe your worldview now?
Man, you pinned me down, Joel. Because I always feel like I'm in process. Man, I would say that I'm a skeptical utopian. And what I mean is that resonates, doesn't it? If you think about me,
Uh-huh.
that seems to make sense, right?
Yeah, it feels right.
I'm skeptical. I think I'm somebody who's always asking questions, and I'm always trying to learn new ideas and go down research rabbit holes, and I do like to ask the hard questions. I like to say, everybody has believed this is true, but what if it's not? It
Yeah,
probably is, but what if it's not? I like to ask those questions.
sure.
So I'm skeptical, but I'm utopian in that I think there's a lot of value in thinking about the perfect worlds and allowing ourselves to have discussions around those things, because, and this is where I deviate from sort of a conservative mentality. My beef with conservatism, I'm using that term in the broadest sense, not just politically, but
Sure.
conservatism in the sense that the traditions have served us well. Let's keep them intact and not try to challenge them. Okay, let's not eradicate traditions, but let's not think that considering new ways of doing things politically and socially and religiously couldn't be very life-giving. That's my sensibility, that we ought to have discussions about what if life could be like this? Like, what if we've got what we need for like everybody to have in our country to have like a high standard of living, and like what some people have called like luxury communism? What if we could at least have that discussion and then work backward from there? Instead, so many times I feel like the conversation just gets shut down. People are like, what we have right now is good. Let's not challenge it. You know who those people are who usually don't want to challenge or change anything? It's the people who are fucking benefiting the most from the system
Yep.
exactly like it is, who are like, well, let's not change anything. It's working quite well.
Why
I'm
would
like,
I
yeah,
change it? Yeah.
yeah, right. It's because you're super comfortable, but there's a lot of people who aren't comfortable, and it's just assumed that the system is working best for them too, when clearly it's
Yeah.
not. So this
Yeah.
is, I would call myself a skeptical utopian. I want to have the discussion, Joel, about how the world could be a more perfect place, even though it's not going to be perfect. But let's at least allow ourselves to dream and not be so stodgy that we're just like, oh, everything's just fine. Let's just keep it like it was. Let's go back to a different era when
Yeah.
it was even better.
Yeah. I used to work for a guy. He was a very kind man. I love him. But he also, he was completely blind to the amount of privilege he had. He was a white man who just he was also very like his personality was privileged. Like he was an entrepreneur and he ran on jet fuel in ways that other people didn't. And I was after I resigned as pastor, I worked with him for a while, and I remember kind of talk with him, and I was complaining out loud. Again, if you're around me often, you're going to hear Joel's opinions. And it was talking about how like when people talk about the good old days, they keep themselves from creating good new days.
Yeah.
And he was like, well, I feel like if we did go back to 50s and 60s, that, that's kind of better, like stronger, more values. And I'm like, yeah, unless you're black.
Yeah.
who wants
Right.
who
Yeah.
wants to
Yeah.
go back to that? And he was like, oh yeah. I was like, yeah, blind spot, dude. Like no one thinks about how these systems create massive harm for people. And so
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
the conversation, is not to say what works for you. Like that's why all these white people love Ayn Rand. It's just like self-interest is the way forward. That works great when you have power. When you don't have power, you're called a protester. When you don't have power, you're called an activist, and they all these kinds of things. So self-interest doesn't work for them. Self-interest is you need to follow my self-interest. I'm just like, stop reading Ayn Rand, guys. She's not a great philosopher.
Sometimes I think of like morality. The discussion about morality is people's attempt to get me to behave in ways that make their lives more pleasant and comfortable.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, I would call myself a Christian mystic, mostly because I love the mystics in the Christian tradition. I don't hold to almost any of the doctrines I used to hold to when I was in seminary, but I do love the Christian mystics because they were always outside of the reigning power structures of the day. They usually got persecuted because of it, but they were the ones that would stay true to maybe the roots of the Christian faith, but they would express it in a way that usually challenged the powers of the day. And those are my favorite people. And I'm not a fan of the murder rates that they experience, but so I tried to do a softer version.
Isn't most of like church history the story of how the church like ruthlessly oppressed people who were actually trying to live like Jesus, you know?
Basically, that's a good way to just, that could be a church history book, and it just has 1 page and 3 sentences that Trent wrote.
Basically what it was. Oh, God.
All right, Trent, take us out. What are your final thoughts? Why do you think pluralism needs to be something that people get more comfortable with and maybe even lean into?
Yeah, well, a closing thought, maybe I didn't emphasize this enough, is pluralism is not for the faint of heart. It's for people who value a rich society that learns how to navigate the very difficult reality of diversity. It is not easy. It is not easy to, join together or learn to coexist, the bumper sticker, with people who are very different from you. But unfortunately, that is the reality, or maybe fortunately, that is the reality that we have in America in this day and age. And I don't think that we can run away from it. We have to confront it. And it's not about, easy tolerance. Haha, this is fun and easy. But no, it's about becoming better people, because we need each other and we don't have all the answers. And it means we're going to have very difficult, unpleasant conversations that maybe don't end well, and you still find that you've got to continue relating with these people. It is a call to like civic courage and civic engagement, not disengagement, not running away from it all. It's a tough task, but I think a worthy one, because it's the reality of a globalized world. And so, deal, bitches. Fucking A, man.
Mic drop from Trent Hunter.
You prodded me yet again, Joel.
Listen, when you're sleeping over in the corner of your cage, I'll take a stick out and I'll poke you right in the ass. We'll see what happens.
Come on.
All right, friends. Thank you for joining us for another fascinating conversation about worldviews gone wild. This was Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. Please reach out to us. You can email us at leadballoonspodcast@gmail.com. You can head over to our website, leadballoonspod, just .com, right?
Yeah, sure enough.
Okay. And then you can just find us on all the platforms. Audio, you can find our podcast on Spotify, our Heart Radio, Apple Podcasts, or you can go on see our lovely faces on our YouTube channel, Lead Balloons Podcast. Trent, any final words?
Hey, let's do it. Keep going, everybody.
Be plural.
Be plural.